de la démocratie en Europe, voire plus loin.
About democracy in Europe and beyond. This is also the title of a book published by Flammarion very recently and written both by Sylvie Goulard and Mario Monti, who are with us this afternoon. Sylvie Goulard is a European MP, and Mario Monti was president of the Italian Council and European Commissioner. This book explores all the issues of democracy in Europe. It is a complex issue full of contradictions, and there is one contradiction in this book. Sylvie and Mario, I'd like you both to dwell on them for a few minutes, and then we will take the questions from the room. But I'd like to hear your views on this. You wrote, far from being the result of rapprochement, the euro led to disagreement. And also you write that the future of Europe is gloomer. So isn't there a contradiction between this and your desire to go further towards a closer union, which is the definition of the founding treaty, the Rome Treaty? So a contradiction between this and reality, the existence of a union which has also led to a number of disappointments or even resentment in terms, well, in political terms, with the resurgence of nationalism. So how do you expect to solve such a contradiction? Well, very briefly, from what you highlighted in our book, there might be apparently a contradiction, but it's not that incompatible, actually, because if the method is not the right one, we may we may realize that the objective is quite legitimate, but we are simply on the wrong track to reach that objective. So this is not a reference to any specific party. The president this morning and François Fillon this afternoon called for an economic government. This is a concept, and I'm thinking about the student who said earlier on today that we should show some spirit of innovation. This is not new. We've talked a lot about this in France, but what really disturbs me here is that we do not exactly know what this word means. It might be an excellent thing if it provides European citizens with the possibility of having a choice, of expressing a choice to see whether the mandate is appropriately carried out, or it can also be something that is very frustrating, because if it is the matter of appointing someone who alone will have to carry out and assume competencies that are both at national and intergovernmental levels. So again, this is not a book with specific solutions, but what we want to say here is that we have to be very specific about the words. If we want to talk about governments, we have to be very specific. Sylvie, what is your reply to those who tell you the further the integration, the least recovery and growth we have in Europe? Well, then my reply is that integration was only partial integration. And what I believe is that we are paying the price of such a partial integration. We have a very integrating discourse, but at the same time, the reality is only a partial integration. So if we don't have something that goes beyond national interests, especially in the euro area, then we are faced with a true problem. Mario Monti. We've heard a number of young people from the European elite. They are quite aware of the challenges. They were trained in the best European universities. Of course, all these young people will always advocate further integration. But you have so many other people who tell you that the result of integration is only unemployment. So what do you tell them? How can you bring back faith into the European project, which was the basis of the political sphere of our generation? Well, I would tell them, as Sylvie said, that integration so far has only been partial and limited. And I would also say that it was not only a matter of integration, there were also other major changes in the world in the economic area. And I would take more than 3 minutes to explain to them that without integration, the situation today would be even worse than it is. And I would add that even if the integration process meant lower growth, it's still worthwhile. Why? Well, because over the last years, the US, China, were only concerned with growth. We, at the same time, built a new entity. And I strongly believe that in the years and decades to come, if Europe were not based on a single currency, on a single market, and on a number of integrated elements that it now has compared to what it had 10 years ago, Europe would not be in a position to ensure appropriate growth. So I believe that the growth that we have lost recently because we focused our political energies more on structural aspects, I believe that growth will recover in the coming years. It is true, and you say in your book, that when people are asked about European construction, people tend to have a negative answer. You were a candidate with a program which was quite respectful of European construction. And finally, Bebe Gelo won. It's not the first party, the winning party, but how can we have acceptance on the part of citizens? Well, in the case of Italy, it is true that we saw quite a number of anti-European positions with Beppe Grillo, with return to Berlusconi as well, and a new political party which was not in existence before, which was the result of the measures I took, and which gathered about 10% of voters in a very short period of time. And this was the subject of a letter that I sent out to my European Council colleagues when I was there in March last time. This is a good case. I mean, Italian elections are a good case to discuss what changes ought to be brought in the presentation, of European policies if we want to reach a consensus. Europe could be considered as has done what it had to do. We have not requested any fund from the European Fund in Italy to rescue us. And I think it is a very specific example of European citizenship on the part of a member state. But even with that, the electoral results were as they were. And I know that this is giving food for thought to our European decision makers and leaders, and contemplate some flexibility that will soon be introduced, I believe. Sylvie Goulard, What is your view on this? I don't think we can say that we asked the European peoples their opinion on European construction. Spain, Luxembourg, yes, and 18 countries said yes through their parliaments. But representative democracy should not be left aside, because on many issues we use Parliament for legal issues and civic rights and other issues. But what did we propose exactly? We propose a treaty, but there is no discussion or debate on the various options. And the referendums that were held were always limited. We never asked all Europeans to give their opinion with a general overall European debate, to hear all the opinions. During Jacques Chirac's government, there was no general debate. It was a sovereignist vote in one way, rejecting Europe, but there were also some people from the left who voted against some of the social and economic policies implemented. Others were against Turkey joining the EU, and simply saying that because there was one referendum in one country which rejected the EU, I think it's too simplistic. But you say, as a lot of Europeans do, that if people say no, it's probably because there was no good explanation given to them, or they did not understand clearly. No, that's not what I said. That's not what I said. I said we could reach 55% no if we aggregate a number of very diverse arguments. And if we don't go into specific analysis of all the elements that constituted a negative referendum, it's true that there is a rise in Euroscepticism, a rise in nationalism, and this is something that we have to take very seriously. On the referendum, I believe that most decisions that have to be made about Europe are quite complex. For example, the question being, would you like to be a member of the EU? This is a meaningful question. But for other more complex questions, such as the one in 2005 on the new constitution, I think that we should not have any inferiority complex if we don't have, or if we don't hold a referendum. In my country, the Constitution prevents any referendum on the ratification of international treaties. And I think it's right, because when the question is very complex, there needs to be some weighting. So in the European construction process, there was a decision made in Paris on May 9th, 1950, by the Schuman Statement, and France and Germany brought together their specific instrument on steel and coal to prevent future wars. But what would have been the result if this position had been submitted to referendum? Where can we find the legitimacy of a more integrated Europe? Through Parliament or through irrelevant MPs? In your book, Sylvie, you say that national democracies are not the ideal either. What we say is that the juxtaposition of several decisions in several countries do not add up to a European decision. It's not because you're going to have several decisions in various countries that you are going to have a legitimate decision at a European level. This is what I'm saying to those young people here. You have to fight to make sure that democracy does exist at European level. There might be several groups of people who want to express themselves, but we have to have this at a European level. For example, the substance, the content is what is of interest to people. But then we need to have people express their opinion on the content. If we had such a debate on the content as we have in the European Parliament, where we have people confronting each other and each other's arguments. It's much better than having an addition of national debates.
Monsieur.
Very well, we're going to listen to your questions now. Could you first introduce yourself? And please be extremely brief when you ask your question.
Bonjour,
Good morning. I am a student in the Masters of European Affairs. A few weeks back, we heard that some mistakes had been made in one of the largest studies, the Hainan in the US. And we know that Europe built all of its policy to face the crisis on this austerity process and concepts. So what is the right balance between theory and democracy? Well, indeed, this is a complex question. We're going to ask it to ask Mario Monti, who was in charge of the definition and the implementation of an austerity policy in terms of spending cuts and tax increases. So what could you answer on this topic? And even, without taking into account the technical mistake that was made, the austerity policy is necessary for rebalancing macroeconomic accounts, but it has some negative impacts, as we mentioned this morning, with youth unemployment. Yes, it's good to find out that some mistakes were made. It's not always easy to understand if there was indeed a mistake or not. But this transatlantic discussion regarding the virtues of austerity is an interesting one. I think it can't be convincing if we forget that, as I was telling you 3 minutes ago, in Europe, it's not just about economic policy, but also economic policy within a complex state where the construction is ongoing. So it's normal, I think, that in Europe there should be more constraints than in the US. If some states that are member of a monetary union but that are not yet part of a state with a political union have to share this currency, but they do not fully trust each other yet. In particular, they are suspicious regarding the fact that fiscal deficit coming from other states could weaken the single currency and therefore their economic fate. So you need to give reassurances to Germany. Is that what you're saying? Reassurances to Germany, but also to all of the virtuous countries at the fiscal level. And right now, Italy, for example, that is concerned given the fiscal developments in France, in Spain, and in the Netherlands, frankly speaking. So it's just like the government support. Even here, we've discussed the competition policies. Why is there a control on state aid and not in the US? Because in Europe, if the European member states were free to give money to their enterprises, that's exactly what they would do. They would give it to their enterprises, and it would destroy the level playing field in the single market. In the US, it doesn't matter. So I think that at last we're discussing the political union, what is a wider concept than the economic European government. So we should measure the economic cost resulting from the lack of a real political union, such having some stricter fiscal constraints. Intellectually, our American friends cannot always understand this. Another question? Yes, sir. Good morning, Geoffroy Beignet, student, first year in Sciences Po. Most of the decisions taken by the European Council are taken on the basis of unanimity. So isn't actually an obstacle for democracy with the tyranny of the minority that can block decisions? Sylvie Goulard, Mario Monti, so the decision-taking process within the Council with a qualified majority or unanimity, so that some minorities can actually block a decision, isn't it an obstacle for democracy? Yes, accept that. And I have to say that I think it was written in our book, but it's very late on the 28th of June 2012 that I realized what the advantages of veto were for the very first time. So the virtues of the rule of unanimity on page 205. So the whole of the European Council, with the 27 members, and in particular 2 members of that council, Mr. Hollande and myself, we really wanted to have a growth pact. So we discussed it, the 27 of us, and then it was 8 p.m., and it looked like everybody was agreeing. So Mr. Van Rompuy and Mr. Barroso were ready to have a press conference to announce this good news, the Growth Pact. And I had to say, sorry, but I will put a veto.
Parce que pour être équilibré, ce pacte.
Why? Because to be balanced, this Growth Pact should be complemented by an agreement within the Eurozone, the Euro Summit, that had been scheduled for later that evening and the following morning to have a mechanism to limit spreads. So I won't tell you about the comments made by our colleagues from the north. Mr. Rajoy was on my side right away. President Hollande was very useful without actually opposing a veto. Anyway, another veto at that point wouldn't have any value because one veto is enough. But he said, I understand the position expressed by Mario. And that didn't please Mrs. Merkel and some of her friends and allies. So we spent the whole night discussing, as well as the following morning, on this pact that gave this intellectual and political coverage for the action of the central bank. Then we had another meeting, the 27 of us, and we removed our veto. And at the end of these 2 days, we had agreements on the 2 topics. So it means that in life, even the worst thing could have some advantages, even a veto. But usually, I think it would be better to use the qualified majority. An external comment, because I wasn't there, of course, but you see the difference between the veto that blocks only because it's promoting the interests of one country, and a veto that is used, that was for the mechanism to fight the spread, but it had really a European dimension, whereas others were opposed to that because of their national interests. So we have to be very careful because, as very often with Mario Monti, it was a very subtle example because some could use the veto only to defend some national interests, as we've seen it during the discussions on the budget. Then it's more controversial. One last question, maybe? So I'm going to ask it. It will be the last one. So this morning, we've discussed the economic levers for growth in Europe and in the Eurozone. So I am asking this question. Do you see any political lever for Europe and the Eurozone to have a longer-term perspective so that it can be more efficient and so that we can end this period of doubt, as you've described it very frankly? Thank you very much. Sylvie Goulard and then Mario Monti. Well, if I had a solution, I would have it patented at the European patent office. But one thing that is very important, I think, based upon a very concrete experience in the Parliament, is that the enemy of European integration is nationalism. And today in Europe, we see this resurgence of some type of nationalism that is postmodern and chic, but is actually a real cancer for Europe. The key issue, the key question is that, are you ready to accept that someone who is not from your country, but who will be chosen based upon his or her skills and expertise, could have a mandate? So the answer should be yes. Otherwise, Europe has no meaning. Or do you see everything through the national prism, the national angle? And do you think that what you want is that your national representatives should have really control over the situation? And this wouldn't be compatible with a single currency. So what we have to fight is not the fact that we love our country, our language, which would be an open and smart patriotism, but the idea that we find in nationalism, which is that the way we do things is better than what the others do. And it's really the interdependence that nationalists are fighting against, because they consider it's a constraint in terms of capability to act against the crisis. Yes, but they're wrong, because interdependence, as Mario Monti said earlier on, it's a global phenomenon. For example, climate change. Well, Europe is not an obstacle for French sovereignty. It's simply the way the climate is changing. The impact of Internet on the police work, you cannot consider that a Minister of Interior, of Home Affairs, has still sovereignty on the national territory, because some people are calling for jihad and there is no way to look for them. So sovereignism, it has a very drastic form, but moderate parties should not flatter sovereignism in national elections and then being helpless because they denied interdependence. Thank you. Mario Monti. Well, interdependence is really the factor, I think, that requires more in terms of political leadership, because interdependence very often is not well perceived. Very often the citizens are not aware of this interdependence. So it's simple for populist activists, and I'm being respectful when I say that. So it's easy for them to call upon the more brutal aspects of the fact that interdependence is not recognized as such. So against everything that is different, the imported products, the immigrants. So what's simple at surface value, at least? Well, this could lead to some arguments based upon populism. So in an integrated area such as the European Union, it's even more difficult than in other national states. There is much populism in the US, we all know that, but at least they do not have to fight to show the advantages of integration, because they are integrated already. Whereas in the European Union, I think we really have to develop some arguments that are strong but simple to show what the advantages of integration are. But to do so, we need political leadership. So more pedagogy and no followership, as we find it among the politicians who read the opinion polls and give you in the short term exactly what people want.